My name is Evelyn Carter, and I never thought that one simple night with my grandson would pull me into a storm darker than any thundercloud I had seen in my 82 years of life. That evening, my daughter-in-law Marissa dropped her 7-year-old son, Caleb, at my home, saying she needed to work a late shift. I didn't suspect anything unusual until, the next morning, Caleb whispered something that made the blood in my veins turn cold. His words were so heavy, so terrifying, that I felt my knees almost give out. And right then, I knew I had no choice but to call for help. That night is carved into my memory like etchings on stone. I can still see the orange glow of the streetlights flickering outside my window, casting long crooked shadows of the oak branches that scratched against the siding of my old house. I live on the edge of Savannah, Georgia, in a humble wooden home where every creak of the floor carries stories of generations past. When Marissa arrived, she stood on my porch as if the night itself was chasing her. Her fingers trembled around the handle of her purse, and her eyes darted nervously toward the street, as though she feared someone might be watching. I welcomed Caleb inside with open arms. He clutched his backpack against his chest, his hair messy, his little sneakers scuffed, and his shirt wrinkled as if he had worn it all day without pause. He gave me a shy smile, one of those smiles that hides more than it shows, and pressed closer to me like he was seeking refuge. Marissa bent down quickly and whispered something into his ear before rising again. She didn't even step through the doorway the way she normally would. Instead, she stood outside, looking restless, her body half-turned as though she was ready to run. "Mom, you don't mind keeping him tonight, right? I'll pick him up tomorrow morning." Her voice cracked on the word tomorrow, and I noticed the faintest glimmer of fear in her eyes. I nodded gently, offering the warmest smile I could. I told her Caleb was always welcome, that he was safe with me. For a brief moment, her gaze met mine. There was something there I couldn't name, something between desperation and guilt. Then, without another word, she turned and hurried down the steps, disappearing into the thick night air. Caleb's little hand was cold when I took it in mine. I led him into the kitchen where the smell of cornbread and vegetable stew lingered. I had spent the afternoon cooking, hoping he would enjoy a proper meal. I set a bowl in front of him, but he only stirred it with his spoon, pushing pieces of carrot around the broth without taking a bite. "Aren't you hungry, baby?" I asked softly, but he shook his head, his lips pressed tight. His big brown eyes avoided mine, fixed instead on the window where the curtain swayed gently with the breeze. The rest of the evening passed in a kind of silence that pressed heavy on my chest. Caleb sat curled up on the old sofa, hugging a frayed blanket I kept in the living room. The television played an animated show, but I could tell he wasn't watching. His eyes looked far away, as if trapped in thoughts no child should carry. I sat beside him, pretending to knit, though my hands shook too much to keep the yarn steady. I wanted to ask him what was wrong, but something about the way he held himself stopped me. He looked fragile, like a glass ornament that might shatter if touched too roughly. Later, I prepared the guest bed beside my own, spreading fresh sheets that smelled faintly of lavender. Caleb slid beneath the covers, clutching the blanket like a lifeline. He turned to face the wall, and as I lay down beside him, I could hear his breathing quicken. He sighed heavily, the kind of weary sigh I recognized all too well from my own sleepless nights after my husband passed. A sound too grown for such a small boy. I reached over, brushed my hand across his curls, and whispered, "Rest, sweetheart, you're safe here." But sometime after midnight, I awoke to soft sobs. Caleb whimpered in his sleep, his face twisted in fear. "Grandma, don't let them take me," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. My heart cracked as I leaned closer, holding him gently. "I'm here, baby. No one's going to take you," I whispered. But inside me, an unease spread like frost creeping across glass. Something was wrong. Deeply, terribly wrong. The morning sun crept into the room through the half-open blinds, streaking the floor with lines of pale gold. I rose early, as I always did, and shuffled into the kitchen to make breakfast. The skillet hissed as I cracked fresh eggs into it, the smell of sizzling butter filling the air. I brewed hot cocoa the way Caleb liked it, with a sprinkle of cinnamon on top, hoping to ease away whatever shadows had haunted him through the night. I wanted him to wake up to warmth, to the feeling of safety that my home had always offered. But when he walked into the kitchen, clutching his blanket around his shoulders, I saw that his eyes were swollen and rimmed red, as though he had cried until sleep finally claimed him. His little lips were pressed together, his body stiff, and even Barnabas, the old teddy bear Lily had once clung to in another story, had no place here. Caleb only held onto his blanket as if it were the last piece of comfort left to him. "Good morning, sweetheart," I greeted, forcing cheer into my voice. "Did you rest at all?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting to the table, then to the floor, and finally up to me with eyes that begged me to understand without words. He pulled himself onto the chair and placed his elbows on the table, his blanket still wrapped tight around his shoulders. I placed the plate of scrambled eggs before him, along with toast and a steaming cup of cocoa. For a moment, he only stared at it, then finally lifted his eyes to me and whispered so softly I almost didn't catch it. "Grandma, Mom said I'm not supposed to tell you what I saw." The words stopped me cold. My hand froze on the handle of the skillet, the butter sputtering loudly behind me as though echoing the crack in my heart. I turned slowly, trying to keep my voice calm despite the tremor in it. "Tell me, baby," I said gently, kneeling beside him so my face was level with his. "You don't have to be afraid. What did you see?" Caleb's lips trembled, his little fingers tightening around the blanket. Tears welled in his eyes, and he shook his head as if fighting against himself. Then, with a shuddering breath, he whispered, "There's a boy locked in the cellar at home. He cries every night, Grandma." He said his feet hurt because they're tied up. The room spun. My breath caught in my throat, and the spatula slipped from my fingers, clattering against the tiled floor. I could barely breathe as I stared at my grandson, his eyes wide with terror, his small voice trembling with a truth too heavy for his years. My chest felt like it was collapsing under the weight of his words. For a moment, I wanted to believe it was only a child's dream, some horrible nightmare spilling into daylight. But Caleb's face's fear was too raw, too real. He wasn't imagining this. He had seen it. I pulled him into my arms, his tiny body quivering like a sparrow caught in a storm. His tears soaked the collar of my housecoat as he buried his face against me. "It's all right, baby," I whispered, though the lie burned in my throat. "Grandma's here. I won't let anything happen to you." Inside, though, I was unraveling. How could this be true? Why would Marissa hide another child in her home? My mind reeled with questions, each one darker than the last, but no answer came. As I held Caleb, I thought of all the years that had led to this moment. I thought of my son David, Caleb's father, and how different life had been before the tragedy took him away. David wasn't a civil engineer like Alex from another story. He had been a school principal, a man of deep patience and steady hands, known throughout our town for his kindness and fairness. The children loved him, the teachers respected him, and I adored him. He had been my rock after my husband passed, the one who promised me that no matter how heavy the world became, he would always shoulder some of that weight for me. But fate has a cruel way of breaking promises. David was driving home late one rainy evening when another car swerved recklessly into his lane. The crash was fatal. I remember the phone call, the way the voice on the other end trembled as it told me he was gone. My world collapsed in that instant. I clutched the receiver so tightly my knuckles turned white, whispering no, 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 as though denial could undo what had already been carved in stone. Caleb had been only 4 at the time, too young to truly understand, yet old enough to sense the hollow silence that followed. At the funeral, he had asked me, his small voice cracking, "Grandma, when will Daddy come back from the hospital?" I had no words. I simply held him and wept. Marissa changed after David's death. She was no longer the bright, smiling young woman who used to bring me flowers for the table, or sit with me baking pies on Sunday afternoons. She became withdrawn, bitter even, her laughter replaced with sharp edges of frustration. I told myself it was grief, that she was broken in ways I couldn't mend. But as months turned into years, her distance grew into something darker. She moved into a small apartment across town, taking Caleb with her, and though I tried to visit, I often felt pushed away. Now, hearing Caleb's words, I realized the darkness inside her had grown into something I could no longer ignore. There was another child, someone hidden, someone hurting, and my grandson had been forced to keep the secret, his tiny shoulders bearing a burden too heavy for him to carry. That morning, as I held him tight against me, I knew one thing with certainty: I couldn't stay silent any longer. After Caleb's confession, I tried to keep myself calm on the outside, but inside, my heart raced so fast I could feel it pounding against my ribs. I needed to know more, yet I couldn't push him too hard. He was trembling already, and I didn't want to scare him further. So, I stroked his curly hair, kissed the crown of his head, and whispered that everything was going to be fine. But the truth was, I didn't believe my own words. I spent the rest of the morning moving around the kitchen, my hands busy with cleaning, my mind drowning in questions. Who was that boy Caleb had seen? Was it possible that Marissa was hiding another child in her home? Or worse, had she become involved in something sinister that I had been blind to all along? Later that day, I decided to take Caleb to school. He needed a sense of normalcy, and I needed a chance to gather my thoughts without his frightened eyes looking back at me. We walked slowly down the cracked sidewalks of my neighborhood, his little hand locked into mine. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of his secret pressed down on both of us. Caleb didn't speak much. He looked down at the pavement, scuffing his shoes against the gravel, his mouth opening a few times only to close again. I asked him gently what he was looking forward to at school, but he just shrugged, his shoulders lifting like he was carrying stones. When we reached the schoolyard, I found his teacher, Mrs. Patterson, standing near the doors, greeting students as they trickled in. She was a woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes softened by kindness, the kind of teacher who noticed things others might overlook. I waited until most of the children had gone inside before approaching her. "Mrs. Patterson, could I have a word?" My voice was low, cautious, as though speaking too loudly might cause the fragile truth to shatter. She nodded and led me into the quiet hallway, the smell of chalk dust and floor polish lingering in the air. I took a deep breath and told her what Caleb had whispered that morning. My words shook as I repeated them. The image of a boy locked in a cellar, twisting my stomach. Mrs. Patterson listened without interrupting, her brow furrowing deeper with each sentence. When I finished, she let out a long sigh and folded her arms across her chest. "Mrs. Carter, I've noticed changes in Caleb too," she said softly. "He's distracted in class, often stares at the floor as if he's somewhere else entirely, and—" she hesitated before continuing, "his drawings have been troubling." "What kind of drawings?" I asked, my throat tightening. "In art class," she explained, "he draws small figures in dark rooms, sometimes with chains or ropes. He never colors them bright, always gray, black, or red. When I ask him about the pictures, he just shakes his head and says he doesn't want to talk about it." Her words struck me like thunder. My heart seemed to collapse in on itself. These drawings, this silence, Caleb's whispers, they were all pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to see but could no longer ignore. I thanked her with trembling hands, trying to keep my tears from spilling in the middle of that hallway. As I walked back outside, I felt weaker than I ever had in my 82 years. I leaned against the brick wall, pressing my palm to it for support, and closed my eyes. The image of that unknown boy crying in the dark haunted me, and Caleb's terrified face was burned into my memory. When I returned home, the house felt unbearably quiet. The walls seemed to echo with whispers of what I had heard that morning. I sat on my porch, staring at the street as the wind rattled the leaves of the old oak tree. That was when I saw Mr. Harris, my neighbor, strolling by with his cane. He was an old widower, sharp-minded despite his years, and he noticed everything that happened on our block. He paused when he saw me, tilting his head with concern. "Mrs. Carter, you look troubled. Is everything all right?" I forced a weak smile, but he didn't buy it. He settled onto the porch swing beside me, his cane resting across his knees. I hesitated, but something in his steady gaze gave me courage. I told him part of what Caleb had said, Not all of it, just enough to measure his reaction. Mr. Harris frowned, his lips pressing into a thin line. After a moment, he leaned closer and lowered his voice. You know, last week I couldn't sleep, so I stepped out to my yard. Around midnight, I saw Marissa coming home with a boy I didn't recognize. It wasn't Caleb. He was smaller, looked thinner, and she dragged him by the arm. I thought maybe it was a relative or a friend's child, but it was odd, given the hour. His words made my skin crawl. I gripped the arm of the swing so tightly I thought the wood might crack beneath my fingers. Are you certain, Mr. Harris? It wasn't Caleb. He shook his head firmly. No, ma'am. I know Caleb well enough. This boy had shorter hair, and he looked scared. The world tilted around me. Between Caleb's whisper, Mrs. Patterson's observations, and now Mr. Harris's account, the shadows around Marissa's home grew darker, more suffocating. I wanted to believe it was all a misunderstanding, but deep in my bones, I knew it wasn't. Something terrible was happening, and I was the only one who seemed willing to see it. That night I barely slept. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the tick of the old clock on the wall. Each second sounded like a hammer in my chest. My mind refused to rest. Caleb's words echoed in my ears, his frightened eyes haunted me, and Mr. Harris's account only deepened my dread. I turned from side to side, whispering silent prayers into the darkness, asking the Lord for strength and guidance. By the time the first pale light of dawn crept into my room, I felt hollowed out, like my soul had been scraped raw. I rose slowly, my bones aching, and sat by the window watching the world stir to life. Birds flitted across the power lines, cars hummed faintly in the distance, and yet my home felt like it stood apart, caught in the grip of some terrible secret I could not escape. When Caleb returned from school that afternoon, I tried to hide my distress. I put on a smile, prepared his favorite grilled cheese sandwich, and even cut it into little triangles the way he liked. But I could see he wasn't fooled. His small eyes studied me carefully, as if he could sense the storm swirling behind my smile. He barely ate, only nibbled at the bread, while keeping his blanket wrapped tightly around him. After a long silence, he whispered, "Grandma, do you believe me?" My throat tightened. I reached across the table, covering his little hand with mine. "Of course I do, baby," I said softly, my voice breaking despite my effort to stay strong. "I believe every word." He nodded slowly, tears forming in his eyes, and leaned into me. As the evening came, I sat on my porch again, the creak of the rocking chair keeping me company. I couldn't shake the image of that unknown boy. I thought of his cries, the way Caleb described them, and the pain in his voice. My heart ached so deeply it felt like someone had placed a stone upon my chest. Then, as if fate wanted to make my torment heavier, I saw Marissa's car pull up across the street. She stepped out quickly, her shoulders tense, her eyes darting up and down as though she was checking to see who might be watching. She hurried inside her apartment without looking in my direction. But in that brief moment, I saw her face clearly. There was no joy there, no trace of the girl who once sat in my kitchen laughing while kneading dough beside me. Instead, her eyes looked hollow, her mouth tight with bitterness. Later that night, I decided I couldn't bear the silence any longer. I took the first bus into downtown Savannah the next morning, my coat wrapped tightly around me though the day was warm. My hands trembled as I held my purse, clutching it like a lifeline. When I reached the precinct, I stood outside the brick building for a long moment, gathering my courage. The flag flapped gently above, the hum of traffic filling the air, but inside me there was only a deafening silence. Finally, I stepped in, greeted by the faint smell of coffee and damp paper. At the front desk, I asked to speak with someone in charge. The young officer on duty looked at me curiously, then guided me into a small office where a weary-looking man sat behind a cluttered desk. His nameplate read Captain Morris. He was in his early 50s, his gray-streaked hair cropped short, his eyes tired as though they had seen too much. He gestured for me to sit, folding his hands on the desk as he asked what had brought me there. My voice shook as I began. I told him everything from Caleb's whispers about the boy in the cellar to Mrs. Patterson's words about his troubling drawings, and finally Mr. Harris's account of seeing Marissa with a strange child in the dead of night. As I spoke, my chest tightened, my breath faltered, but I forced myself to keep going. Every word felt like a stone laid down, building a wall of truth that I prayed would stand. When I finished, Captain Morris leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He tapped a pen slowly against the desk, then let out a long sigh. "Mrs. Carter, I understand your concern," he said, his voice measured, "but what you've given me here is troubling only in suggestion. We can't request a warrant based on the testimony of a child, some drawings, and a neighbor's late-night sighting. There's no tangible evidence." His words struck me like a slap. My heart sank into my stomach. I leaned forward, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. "But what if it's true?" I pleaded, my voice breaking. "What if that boy is down there right now, tied up, crying? If we do nothing, what happens to him?" For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, perhaps compassion, perhaps doubt, but it vanished quickly as he shook his head. "I'll file your statement, Mrs. Carter. But until we have more proof, there's nothing more I can do." His words echoed in my ears like a cruel verdict. I sat frozen, tears burning my eyes. I wanted to scream, to beg, to shake him until he understood. But instead, I nodded faintly, rose on trembling legs, and whispered, "Thank you, sir." As I walked out of the precinct, the weight of the world pressed down on me. The bright afternoon sun felt cold, the noise of the city muffled as though I were moving underwater. I stood at the bus stop with tears streaming silently down my cheeks, whispering to myself, "What do I do now?" I rode home on that bus, clutching the metal pole as if it were the only thing keeping me upright. The city sliding by in sun-faded colors while my thoughts churned like a storm tied against the marsh. When I stepped off at my stop, the afternoon heat wrapped itself around me, and still I shivered. I walked past the corner store and nodded to folks I'd known for decades. But their faces seemed far away, like pictures hung crooked on a wall. Inside my house, the quiet felt heavier than before, the kind that pushes on your chest and steals the air from your lungs. I folded and unfolded a dish towel in my lap, and told myself again that I had done the right thing, even if the captain's words had landed like stones. "Proof," he said, as though a child's tears were not proof enough. I stood and moved from room to room, touching the backs of chairs, smoothing the bedspread, straightening David's framed photo on the hallway shelf the way I always did when I needed his steadiness. "Help me see what's next," I murmured, tracing the edge of the glass. And for a heartbeat, I swear I felt that old calm of his coming off the picture like warmth from a stove. When the school day ended, I brought Caleb home and tried to stitch the afternoon together with small, ordinary things, shelling peas at the sink, humming old hymns under my breath, setting the table with the blue plates I save for company. He sat nearby, coloring quietly, pressing hard enough on the crayons to snap the tips. I kept my voice gentle and let the silence be what it needed to be. After supper, I walked him down to the little park at the end of the street, so he could climb the low steps and swing a while before dusk. The river breeze moved through the pines, and for a few minutes I believed we might be safe inside that ordinary evening. But fear is a patient shadow. It doesn't leave just because you turn on a porch light. On our way back, I heard my name in the thin, cutting tone that travels faster than a shout. "Ms. Carter." I turned to see two women from the neighborhood, Verna, who sells pies on Sundays, and young Patrice, with her bright scarves, standing beneath the store awning. Their arms crossed, their whispers not nearly as soft as they thought. "It's a shame," Verna said to Patrice, eyes flicking toward me in a way like trapped minnows. "Some folks get lonely and make up stories to keep themselves busy." Patrice chewed her lip, then sighed heavy. "And to say such things about family," she added. They pretended to study the display of watermelons, but they were studying me. The words slid into my back like ice. I held Caleb's hand a little tighter and kept walking. In a town like ours, news doesn't travel, it blooms all at once, like wisteria swallowing a fence. By the time we reached my gate, a car rolled up and the headlights washed across my porch. Marissa stepped out, and with her came a man I had only met once at a holiday cookout, her cousin Lionel, a man broad through the shoulders with a voice that liked to fill spaces. Marissa's face was blotchy, eyes glass bright, and she clutched her keys so tight I could hear the metal bite her palm. "You need to stop," she said before she even reached the steps. "I know you went to the police. I know you're saying I'm doing things." The last word broke, and she swallowed it down like something bitter. Lionel planted himself at the bottom step, chin lifted. "This harassment won't stand," he said. The kind of sentence men say when they're performing for the crowd that's gathering. Because of course, a crowd was gathering, neighbors drifting onto porches and sidewalks, drawn by the heat of trouble the way moths find a porch bulb. I felt my spine stiffen the way it does when a storm is coming in off the water. "I told the truth to the authorities," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "Caleb is frightened. A child is in danger." Marissa laughed, then a small, sharp sound that didn't belong to the woman who once baked blackberry cobbler in my kitchen and licked purple sugar from her fingers. "He's 7, Evelyn. 7, kids say things." She glanced at the faces inching closer, hungry for the shape of a story. "She's confused," she told them brightly, tilting her head toward me like I was a sweet old woman who had lost track of her own house keys. "Since David passed, she sometimes imagines things." A murmur went up, that soft, eager sound people make when given permission to believe the easiest version of events. Lionel pointed past me toward my door. "Hand Caleb over. You've done enough." Caleb's fingers dug into mine. I felt the tremor moving through him like a small animal trying not to be seen. I looked at Marissa. "If you are fine, if there is nothing to hide, then let someone check. Let someone hear that other child's voice." For a flicker, something crossed her face. Fear, grief, maybe both. But it was gone as quick as lightning. "There is no other child," she said, each word clipped like a clipped thread. "And if you keep this up, I'll make sure you don't see Caleb for a long time." That last part, she said soft enough for only me to hear, a small dagger wrapped in velvet. The street hummed with the neighbor's breath. Mr. Harris stood back in the shadow near his mailbox, his jaw tight, his eyes on me. Verna shook her head slowly like a metronome of disapproval. I wanted to shout that courage and cruelty often wear the same mask. That grief can sour into something you don't recognize until it's knocking on your door with witnesses. Instead, I knelt to Caleb, brought my forehead to his, and said, "You are brave. You are safe with me." Then I straightened, opened my door, and stepped aside. "Come in and sit a while," I told Marissa, an invitation and a test all at once. She hesitated, keys biting deeper into her skin, and then she shook her head. "No," she said, and reached for Caleb's arm. I felt the old iron core inside me, the one that had carried babies in my arms and coffins on my shoulders, rise up. "Not tonight," I told her calmly. "He's staying here. You can call your lawyer if you like." Lionel snorted, but he didn't climb the steps. Marissa stared at me for a long second, and all the noise of the street fell away until there were only 2 mothers, one drowning, one refusing to let go. Finally, she turned on her heel, slid into the car, and drove off too fast, tires whispering over the sandy curb. The crowd broke into fragments of talk and drifted home. I closed the door, slid the chain in place, and breathed in the quiet until my lungs remembered how to work. Inside, Caleb leaned against me and began to cry without sound, the kind of crying that shakes a child to pieces. I held him and rocked, my chair creaking its old lullaby, and I made a silent vow that even if I had to gather proof with these arthritic hands, I would not stop until someone listened. The night after that confrontation, my home felt like a fortress under siege, though all I had for defense were 4 old walls and the weight of my faith. Caleb slept fitfully in the spare bed, his small body twitching with dreams he would not share, and I sat in my rocking chair by the window, watching shadows crawl across the yard. Every groan of the floorboards, every rustle of the magnolia outside, made me tense. I felt like the world was pressing in, trying to silence me before I could find a way to act. Yet as the hours stretched on, I resolved that I would not fold. I had carried 8 decades of burdens, grief, loss, the endless work of survival. This was one more battle, and I would see it through. The next morning, I rose early, fixing oatmeal with brown sugar and slices of peach. Caleb picked at it but ate enough to warm my heart a little. After breakfast, I walked him to school, and though he clung to my hand, he gave me a tiny smile when I told him he was braver than most men I had ever known. When I left him at the classroom door, I caught Mrs. Patterson's eye. She gave me a slight nod, her face clouded with worry, and I knew she, too, carried the weight of Caleb's drawings in her mind. Back home, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the phone. The captain's words replayed in my ears. Not enough evidence. It gnawed at me like a rat in the dark. If the law would not move without proof, then proof was what I needed to find. My hands shook as I dialed Mr. Harris's number, the rotary clicking slow and heavy. When he answered, I asked if he could come over. Within half an hour, he was sitting across from me, his cane resting against the chair. I told him plainly that the police would not act without more, and that I couldn't live with myself if we ignored Caleb's cries. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully, his old eyes sharper than a knife. I can keep watch, he said finally. If she's bringing that boy in and out, I'll see it. But be careful, Evelyn. Folks already whisper. That evening, as twilight draped itself across the rooftops, I stepped onto my porch and looked toward Marissa's apartment. The windows glowed faintly, curtains drawn tight. I could almost imagine the sound of a muffled sob slipping through those walls, though perhaps it was only my heart, echoing what Caleb had told me. Still, I stayed there until the street grew quiet, until the last dog barked itself hoarse, until I felt the night itself was daring me to move. I whispered into the darkness, Lord, if there is a child in pain, let the truth break free. 2 nights later, Mr. Harris knocked on my door just after dawn, his face pale, his lips pressed thin. I saw her again, he said in a hushed tone. Near midnight, she came out with the boy. Small frame, short hair, carrying a blanket. He looked half asleep, or half broken. She led him to the car and drove off. His words landed in my chest like iron. This was no longer Caleb's whisper alone. Another set of eyes had seen what should never have been seen. That day, I felt a fierce determination surge through me. I wrote everything down: Caleb's words, Mrs. Patterson's observations, Mr. Harris's sightings. Page after page in my neat cursive, each detail preserved like evidence in a trial. My hands cramped, but I would not stop. When I was done, I folded the papers into an envelope and placed it by the door, ready to carry back to the precinct. If they would not listen to my voice, perhaps they would listen to the weight of words on paper. But before I could take that step, the storm grew louder. That evening, Marissa returned, not with Lionel this time, but with 2 neighbors trailing her, their faces set with judgment. She raised her voice for all to hear, declaring that I was confused, that grief had rotted my mind, that I was poisoning Caleb against his own mother. The neighbors nodded, their eyes sliding over me with pity that cut deeper than anger. I stood in my doorway, Caleb clutching my dress from behind, and for a moment I wondered if I had the strength to keep standing. Yet when I looked down at him, at his trembling lips and desperate eyes, I knew there was no choice. I would endure their whispers, their pity, their judgment, because somewhere, a child was waiting in darkness for someone to believe. The days that followed blurred together, each one heavy with suspicion and fear. Every time I walked through the market, I felt eyes following me. Conversations hushed when I drew near, and when I turned my back, the whispers rose like smoke. Poor Evelyn, losing her grip, I heard once near the fruit stand, another time at the church steps. Someone muttered, "She means well, but grief has made her see shadows where there aren't any." Each word cut deeper than a knife, but I held my head high, reminding myself that the truth doesn't need everyone to believe it, only needs one moment to be revealed. Inside my house, Caleb remained quiet but close. He followed me from room to room, never straying far. At night, he curled up in the bed beside me, his small hands clutching my arm as if I might vanish if he let go. More than once, I woke to hear him mumbling in his sleep, "Don't leave him there, Grandma. Don't leave him." Those words lit a fire in me. I could not abandon that unseen boy, not when Caleb's nightmares made his presence feel so real. One afternoon, I decided I needed to press Marissa face to face. No more half-spoken words in the street. I walked to her apartment, my cane clicking against the sidewalk, my knees protesting with each step. When she opened the door, surprise flickered in her eyes, quickly masked by irritation. "What now?" she asked, her voice flat. I steadied my breath and said, "I came to ask you one question, and I want you to look me in the eye when you answer. Is there another child here? One you've kept hidden?" For a moment, her expression cracked, just a flicker of panic, gone in a blink. Then she scoffed. "You're delusional," she snapped. "You're trying to ruin me." She slammed the door so hard, the glass pane rattled. I stood there on the step, my hands trembling, my heart pounding like a drum. But I had seen enough in that flicker to know she was hiding something. That night, I wrote another letter, this time not just to the police, but also to the Child Welfare Office. I described everything again in painstaking detail. Caleb's confession, the teacher's testimony, Mr. Harris's sightings, my own confrontation with Marissa. I sealed it with shaking hands and prayed that someone, somewhere, would take it seriously. A few days later, while waiting on word back from the authorities, I received a knock on my door. It was Mrs. Patterson, her face drawn with worry. She stepped inside, clutching a stack of Caleb's recent drawings. "I thought you should see these," she said quietly. She spread them on my table, more images of small figures in confined spaces, one with ropes around the ankles, another with tears drawn in thick black lines streaming down the face. My chest ached as I traced the little stick figures' outlines with my finger. "He knows more than he can say," Mrs. Patterson whispered. "I've been teaching for 30 years, and I've never seen a child carry such heavy shadows in their art." That evening, as twilight deepened into night, I sat again on my porch. Mr. Harris came by, his cane tapping the sidewalk, and lowered himself onto the bench beside me. "She's moving differently now," he muttered. "Curtains drawn earlier, lights off by 9, as if she wants no one to notice. But Evelyn, I hear sounds, low cries when the street is quiet." His words made my stomach clench. The shadows I had sensed now had weight, texture, reality. I looked up at the dark sky, the first stars breaking through. "If they won't act, then we must," I said firmly, though my voice trembled with the enormity of it. Mr. Harris studied me a long moment before nodding. "I'll stand with you," he said. And in that promise, I felt the first spark of hope since Caleb's whisper had shattered my peace. The following morning, I woke with a fierce determination that pushed aside the frailty of my years. I brewed a pot of strong coffee, tied a scarf around my head, and gathered every note and letter I had written. My hands ached from the hours of scribbling, but the stack of papers on my table felt like a shield. I was no detective, no lawyer, but I knew the power of testimony when gathered with persistence. After breakfast, I walked Caleb to school, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "You are stronger than you know." He nodded, his eyes heavy with the kind of understanding a child should never have to carry. When I left him at the classroom door, I carried the weight of both our hearts with me. Back home, Mr. Harris was waiting by my porch. His cane tapped against the wood as he leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "I watched again last night," he said quietly. "I swear I heard a thump from below her house, and then silence. She's keeping something hidden. You can feel it in the air." His words churned my stomach, but they also steeled my resolve. "Then we don't stop," I told him. "We gather, we press, we knock until someone listens." He nodded, his jaw set. "We won't let this vanish into rumor." That afternoon, I took the bus downtown again, this time straight to the Child Welfare Office. The waiting room smelled of disinfectant and despair, the chairs lined with weary parents and restless children. I clutched my envelope tight, my knuckles white, until a woman in a blue blouse called my name. Her office was small, the blinds half drawn, papers stacked in teetering piles. She asked what brought me there, and I laid everything before her: Caleb's words, Mrs. Patterson's testimony, Mr. Harris's accounts, My letters. My voice shook, but I did not stop. Please, I begged, if there is a child in that home. Every day we delay is another day of suffering. The woman listened, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the pages. She asked careful questions, pressing for detail. When I finished, she sighed, folding her hands atop the stack. Mrs. Carter, she said softly, this is troubling. I will assign an investigator, but these processes take time. The words hit me like cold water. But I nodded, knowing at least a small crack had opened in the wall of silence. As I left the office, I whispered a prayer that time would not betray that unseen boy. When I returned home, Marissa was waiting near my gate, her arms crossed, her eyes burning with fury. What did you do? She hissed, her voice low enough that only I could hear. Do you think I don't know you've been spreading lies? You want Caleb to hate me, don't you? You want to steal him away. Her words poured like venom, but I stood my ground. I want the truth, I said steadily. If you have nothing to hide, then why fear the light? For a heartbeat, her mask slipped again. A tremor in her jaw, a darting glance to the ground. Then she spat, you'll regret this. She turned and stormed off, her footsteps sharp against the pavement. That night, Caleb refused to sleep in the spare bed. He curled beside me, his small body pressed close, whispering, don't let them take me back. Grandma, I held him tight, rocking gently as the house creaked around us, my chair moaning with each sway. I won't, I promised, though my voice trembled with doubt. The darkness outside seemed alive, heavy with secrets, and I knew the battle was far from over. The next morning, word spread that Marissa had gone door to door, telling neighbors I was inventing stories because my mind was failing. At the corner store, I caught the tail end of it. Poor old woman, losing herself. She should be resting, not chasing ghosts. The sting of their pity nearly broke me. But when I walked back home and saw Caleb waiting at the window, his little face pressed against the glass, I felt my spine straighten. Their whispers could not outweigh the truth beating inside that child's heart. The weight of those whispers followed me everywhere. At church on Sunday, the pew that was once filled with warm greetings now held silence. Sisters who used to hug me offered only stiff nods, and a few even avoided my gaze altogether. I sat with Caleb beside me, his small hand gripping mine, and as the choir lifted their voices, I found my own lips could not form the words. Instead, I prayed silently, asking the Lord to give me courage to keep standing tall, even as the ground beneath me seemed to crumble. Faith has always been my anchor, and in that moment, I clung to it as if it were the last rope keeping me from drowning. That afternoon, after church, Mr. Harris knocked again. He stepped inside, his eyes storm dark, his cane tapping against the floor. I need to tell you what I saw last night, he whispered. The boy, I saw him at the window. Just for a second. He pulled the curtain back, and then it closed quick, like someone yanked him away. His words made my knees buckle, and I sank into the chair. A child, alive, in that house, reaching for the outside world. That's enough, I said, my voice trembling but strong. That's enough to go back. I gathered every page of my notes, Caleb's drawings, Mrs. Patterson's testimony, and Mr. Harris's new account. This time I wasn't going to plead. I was going to demand. With the envelope clutched to my chest, I boarded the bus once more, the faces of the passengers blurring past me, my focus sharp as a blade. At the precinct, I marched to the desk and insisted to speak with Captain Morris again. He looked up, weary as before, but I placed the envelope down in front of him with a firmness that surprised even me. You asked for more, and here it is, I said. You have the words of a child, the testimony of a teacher, the witness of a neighbor, and now the sight of a boy at the window. If you do nothing, Captain, and that child is found harmed, his suffering will rest on your conscience as much as hers. For a moment, silence stretched long between us. His pen tapped against the desk, his jaw tightening. Then he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Mrs. Carter, he said slowly, I will send an officer to look. No promises, but we'll check. Relief and fear collided in me at once, my heart pounding as I left the office. Finally, a step forward. But would it be enough? That night, I kept Caleb close, reading him stories until his eyelids drooped. But my own rest never came. I sat by the window, my rocking chair creaking with every sway, and stared at the street until dawn. When the knock finally came the next day, my heart leaped. It was an officer, his expression tight, his words measured. We visited the residence. We saw nothing unusual. Curtains drawn, doors locked. Without further evidence, we cannot proceed. The ground seemed to fall out from under me. My mouth went dry, my hands clenched so tight the bones ached. You didn't even look beneath the house? I asked, my voice rising. He only shook his head. Ma'am, we can't force entry without a warrant. I'm sorry. As he left, I stood in the doorway trembling, fury boiling inside me. Caleb came to my side, his little eyes searching my face. They didn't help, did they? He asked softly. I pulled him close, swallowing the lump in my throat. Not yet, baby, I whispered. But Grandma won't stop. His arms tightened around me, and I felt the fragile weight of his trust settle on my shoulders. Later that day, as I walked to the store, I heard the whispers again. She's stirring trouble, someone muttered, accusing her own kin. But I didn't falter. I kept walking, my head high, because somewhere behind those drawn curtains was a child praying for someone to keep fighting. And I would not let my age, my fear, or the cruelty of others silence me. I had lived too long, and seen too much to walk away now. The days that followed tested the very edges of my strength. The police had turned me away again. The neighbors treated me like a ghost, whose words carried no weight. And even the pastor at church urged me to find peace in prayer rather than stir conflict. But how could I rest when I knew a child might be chained in darkness? Every night I listened for the sound of cries carried on the wind. Every morning I woke with the bitter taste of helplessness in my mouth. Yet through it all, Caleb's eyes anchored me. Each time he whispered, "Grandma, don't stop," I felt fire rush through my veins. Stronger than any medicine, stronger than age itself. His faith in me became my strength. One evening, as the cicadas buzzed loud in the trees, and the heat clung heavy to the air, I sat once more on my porch with Mr. Harris. He leaned close, his voice low. I saw movement again last night. The curtain shifted. That boy is in there, Evelyn. He's real. His words confirmed what my soul already knew. Then I will not rest, I answered, my voice trembling but firm. I decided then that even if the law moved slow as molasses, I would be the storm that rattled its windows until someone opened the door. I began writing letters not just to the precinct but to local newspapers, to radio stations, to anyone who might hear me. I knew some would dismiss me as a rambling old woman, but one voice reaching the right ears could change everything. In the middle of this struggle, Marissa appeared at my door once more. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion, her words sharp as glass. "You've destroyed my life," she hissed. "The whole neighborhood thinks I'm a monster because of you." I looked at her, the girl I once welcomed into my family with open arms, and for a moment sorrow overwhelmed my anger. "Marissa," I said gently, "I don't want to destroy you. I only want to save that boy." Her lips parted as if she might confess, but then she shook her head violently and fled, slamming her car door before speeding away. I stood in the doorway long after, my chest aching, wondering how grief had twisted her so far from the light she once carried. The next morning, Caleb came into the kitchen, clutching one of his drawings. He laid it on the table without a word. The picture showed two figures holding hands, one small, one taller, and behind them, bars breaking apart, cracks spreading wide. He looked up at me with eyes brimming with fragile hope. "Does this mean he'll get free, Grandma?" My throat closed, but I pulled him into my arms and whispered, "Yes, baby. We'll see to it." And though I couldn't promise when or how, I knew in that moment I would fight until my last breath to make it true. I don't know how this story will end, not yet. Perhaps one day soon, the truth will burst forth, undeniable, and the child hidden in shadows will finally step into the sun. Or perhaps the world will keep turning slow, grinding its gears, while I keep pounding on its doors. But one thing I know with certainty: silence is the cruelest weapon, and I will not wield it. My voice may tremble, my hands may shake, but they will not be still. For the sake of Caleb, and for the boy who waits unseen, I will keep speaking until someone listens. And to you, dear soul, listening to my story now, if it has reached your ears, let it also reach your heart. Do not turn away from the cries of the vulnerable, even when the world tells you to. I ask you, with all the warmth of a grandmother's love, to subscribe to this channel, to become part of this circle of voices that refuses to be silent. Share your own stories in the comments below, the ones heavy on your chest that need release. Tell us what you felt, what you learned walking beside me through this long night. Let us build a community where no pain goes unheard, where no secret festers in the dark. Together, we are stronger. Together, we can be the light that breaks the bars.